Chapter 11. Mark's Master Plan. Mark had made a terrible mistake. A mistake that had haunted him for the last 2 days. At first, he had been too busy sulking to think about it properly. But then, in a rare moment of self-reflection, forced upon him by Nina, who had very helpfully suggested that he stop being an emotionally constipated disaster, Mark realized something horrific. Elliot had actually been hurt. Sure, his constant teasing and over-the-top flirting had been ridiculous. But what if he had been serious? What if all of his stupid, dramatic attempts to seduce Mark hadn't just been an elaborate joke? What if Mark had pushed him away? Mark felt physically ill, which brought him to his new problem, getting rid of the new guy. New guy whose name Mark refused to learn had returned to the cafe. Worse, Elliot was happy to see him. Mark had options. Arson. Effective, but messy. Getting Nina to kick the guy out. Less messy, but Nina was enjoying Mark's misery too much to help. Being a mature, reasonable adult. Operation Sabotage. Mark picked option 4. He strode over to Elliot and new guy with the confidence of a man who absolutely knew what he was doing. He did not. Elliot, he said, voice perfectly neutral. Break's over. You need to get back to work. Elliot blinked at him. I don't work here. Mark faltered for exactly 1 second before continuing. Management says you do. Elliot snorted. What, did Nina hire me behind my back? Yes, Mark said, unwavering. We're short-staffed. Elliot folded his arms. Oh, really? And what's my job description? Mark's brain stalled. Table wiper. That's the worst fake job title I've ever heard. It's an important job. Mark shot back. Somebody's got to do it. Elliot turned to new guy, who was watching the exchange like it was the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. He's trying to get rid of you. New guy chuckled. Mark immediately hated him more than he had ever hated anyone in his life. You're jealous, Elliot said smugly. Mark scoffed. Jealous? Of him? He waved a dismissive hand in new guy's direction. New guy blinked. I am literally right here. I don't care, Mark muttered. Elliot grinned. You're jealous. I'm not jealous, Mark said, jealously. Elliot leaned in, voice low and teasing. You want me all to yourself, huh? Mark's brain short-circuited. New guy laughed. Dude, is this your boyfriend? Mark choked. Elliot just shrugged, looking entirely unbothered. Not yet. Mark's brain fully imploded. New guy patted Mark on the shoulder. Good luck, man. You're gonna need it. And then, finally, he left. Mark stood there, reeling, as Elliot strolled past him with the smuggest smile on his face. Mark's plan had worked. So why did it feel like Elliot had still won? Chapter 12. Is it love? After the whole disaster, Mark finally remembered the video call he promised his father. Not long after his father managed to pry out all the frustration from his head. He's insufferable, he muttered. His father raised an eyebrow over the video call. Mark scoffed. He never shuts up. He's always in my space, always pushing my buttons. Mark hesitated, jaw tightening. He keeps looking at me like he knows something I don't. His father hummed, a knowing glint in his eyes. Sounds exhausting. You have no idea, Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. He flirts just to annoy me. He does this thing where he touches my arm for way too long, like he's testing me, waiting for me to react. And I do react, but then he just laughs like it's a game. And his father chuckled. So you like him? Mark froze. His father's voice was calm, patient. Son, if you didn't like him, you wouldn't be this worked up. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt his heart hammering in his chest. And for the first time, he let himself sit with the thought. Elliot, the way he lit up every room he walked into. The way he was infuriating and relentless and alive in a way that Mark had never dared to be. Mark took a deep breath. I'm bisexual. His dad chuckled. Yeah, okay. Not exactly a shock. Mark gaped. What do you mean not a shock? His dad leaned back with a smirk. I've seen the way you talk about Elliot, the human headache. And before that, your so-called rivalry with that boy in high school. You've been broadcasting in high definition for years. Mark groaned, dragging a hand down his face. This is humiliating. His father chuckled. Your mother was just like that. Loud, dramatic, always pulling people into her orbit. I used to think she was a menace. But then one day, I realized I never wanted to be anywhere she wasn't. He looked at Mark, gentle but firm. Unfortunately, you are your father's son, and I think you already know how you feel. Mark shut his eyes briefly, exhaling. When he opened them, he felt lighter. Yeah, he admitted. I think I do. Chapter 13. Elliot's Admirer. After the cafe incident where Mark had spent way too much energy trying to subtly, and failing miserably, get rid of Elliot's random admirer, Elliot had decided that Mark needed to be dealt with. And what better way to do that than by invading his personal space and forcing him to watch a movie he would absolutely hate? Which was why Elliot was now sprawled across Mark's couch, stealing all the good pillows, aggressively scrolling through Mark's obscenely large TV streaming options, while Mark stood stiffly in the doorway, looking as if he had made a grave mistake. To be fair, he had tried to stop this. He had tried to tell Elliot that he was busy, that he had things to do, that maybe, just maybe, Elliot could harass him another day. But Elliot had simply tilted his head, raised a single eyebrow, and said, "Huh, weird. You had time to act like a jealous weirdo earlier. But suddenly, you don't have time for me?" Mark had choked at that. Then Elliot had smiled, and then he had followed Mark home like a feral cat, completely ignoring every single attempt to shake him off. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Elliot, oh, shut up. Your TV is amazing." Elliot tossed a look over his shoulder, grinning. "Seriously, why do you, a man who hates fun, have such a cinematic masterpiece of a television?" Mark scowled. "I don't hate fun." Elliot snorted. "Right, my bad. You begrudgingly tolerate fun. Anyway, we're watching something stupid and romantic. So sit down." Mark remained frozen in place, jaw tight, because this wasn't normal. This wasn't casual. Not when Elliot smelled way too good. Not when Elliot was currently stretching across his couch, legs spread, looking like he belonged there. Mark clenched his fists. Elliot, still scrolling through movie titles, threw him a glance. "You look tense." "I'm fine," Mark gritted out. Elliot hummed. "Good, because I definitely didn't pick a movie where two enemies slowly fall in love in the most absurdly romantic way possible." Mark inhaled sharply through his nose. This was going to be hell. Chapter 14. Winter. Mark should have known. He should have known that spending an evening alone with Elliot in his apartment, on his couch, watching a movie that was obscenely romantic, was a horrible idea, because now Elliot was right there, close enough that Mark could feel his body heat, close enough that every time Elliot shifted, his knee brushed against Mark's thigh, close enough that Mark's pulse had been a consistent nightmare for the past 45 minutes. And the worst part? Elliot knew it. That insufferable smirk. The way he kept leaning into Mark's space, stretching his arms over his head way too dramatically, whispering little comments like, "Wow, they have so much tension. Do you think they're gonna kiss yet? I think they should kiss." "Mark, buddy, you're a romance expert. Tell me when's the best time for a big, dramatic love confession?" Mark had ignored him, refused to react, because that's what Elliot wanted, and Mark would sooner die than give him the satisfaction. But then Elliot had turned his entire body, facing Mark fully, stretching out on the couch like he owned it, resting his chin on his hand, eyes sharp with mischief. "Hey, Mark." Mark swallowed. His voice was rough when he responded. "What?" Elliot's smirk widened. "Just admit you like me." Mark's brain short-circuited. For a second, all he could hear was the hum of the TV, the sound of his own pulse roaring in his ears. Elliot's face was too close, his voice low and teasing. But God help him, there was something real under the humor. Mark's hands clenched into fists on his lap. He wanted to look away, wanted to roll his eyes, call Elliot ridiculous, make some sarcastic comment that would push him back, create some distance. But his body refused to listen. And then, before he could stop himself, before he could think of all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, he moved, shoving Elliot down onto the couch, pinning him there, his knee between Elliot's legs, his hands gripping Elliot's wrists, his breath ragged. Elliot's eyes widened. Mark stared down at him, dark, unreadable. He didn't say anything. He couldn't, because Elliot had won. But Mark wasn't about to let him win that easily. Chapter 15. One step closer. Mark had made a mistake. A big mistake. Pinning Elliot down like that? Huge mistake. Because the second he had, reality had slapped him in the face with the force of 1,000 bricks. He had been this close to kissing Elliot. Elliot, who was currently lying under him, all smug and wide-eyed and utterly infuriating, as if this was exactly what he wanted. Mark had panicked. He had let go immediately, yanking himself back so fast he nearly fell off the couch. He had stammered out some barely coherent excuse, something about needing to leave, despite the fact that this was his own apartment, and had practically fled to his bedroom, leaving Elliot laughing behind him. And now it was morning. Mark stood stiffly at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, glaring down at Elliot, who was sprawled out on his stomach, sheets tangled around his legs, looking altogether too pleased with himself. "Morning, sleepyhead," Elliot drawled, voice thick with amusement. Mark scowled. This was fine. He could play it cool. Nothing happened. Nothing weird, at least. Except, he glanced down. Elliot's phone was open to their chat, and Mark's stomach dropped when he read the last text Elliot had sent. "Admit you like me." Mark clenched his jaw, warmth creeping up his neck. Elliot grinned up at him, chin propped on his hands. Well, Mark hated him. Mark also liked him. Mark was so screwed. Chapter 16, Love. Mark had already accepted his fate. There was no other explanation for why he was standing in his own kitchen, barefoot, watching Elliot Carter flip pancakes like he had just won an Olympic medal in breakfast. "You're insufferable," Mark muttered, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Elliot beamed at him, practically glowing. "You love it." Mark scowled. "I tolerate it." Elliot clicked his tongue. "Denial isn't just a river in Egypt." Mark groaned, dragging a hand down his face. This was his life now. This was actually his life. And the worst part? It made him stupidly happy. The sunlight streaming through the window. The smell of coffee and freshly made pancakes. Mark had never imagined this for himself. But now that it was here, now that it was real, he wasn't sure he could live without it. Elliot plated the pancakes with a flourish before sliding them in front of Mark with a dramatic bow. "Your breakfast, my dear sir." Mark raised an eyebrow. "So you admit pancakes are superior to waffles?" Elliot gasped, clutching his chest like Mark had physically wounded him. "How dare you?" Mark smirked. "You just made pancakes. With your own hands. This is admittance. I was forced to make them." Elliot insisted. "Against my will. Like a prisoner of war." Mark sat down, cutting into his pancake with a lazy smirk. "You don't seem to be complaining." Elliot dramatically threw himself into the seat across from Mark, pouting. "This doesn't mean anything." Mark chewed thoughtfully. "No?" Elliot narrowed his eyes. "No." Mark hummed, reaching out with his fork to steal a bite from Elliot's plate. Elliot gasped. "You betrayer." Mark just shrugged, chewing slowly, watching as Elliot bristled, ready to launch into a full-blown rant. And then something shifted. It was subtle. The way Elliot's shoulders relaxed just slightly. The way his eyes softened even as he glared. The way his knee nudged against Mark's under the table, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And that's when it hit Mark. This is real, not a game, not some fleeting moment, not a trick of his own wishful thinking. Elliot was here. He had chosen to be here, with Mark, and that was enough to make Mark's heart do something stupid and embarrassing in his chest. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing against Elliot's on the table. Elliot blinked, glancing down at their hands before looking back up at Mark, brows raised in amusement. "Wow," Elliot drawled. "Are you getting soft on me?" Mark rolled his eyes, but didn't pull away. "Shut up." Elliot smirked, but there was a hint of pink on his cheeks. And then, because Elliot never knew when to quit, he leaned in, tilting his head dramatically. "If you wanted to hold my hand, you could have just asked." Mark kissed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was just Elliot and warmth and inevitability. Elliot made a tiny, surprised sound, freezing for just a second before melting into it, fingers curling into the fabric of Mark's hoodie. Mark kept it slow, kept it gentle, because as much as Elliot liked to throw himself headfirst into everything, Mark knew this was different. And when he pulled back, Elliot's eyes were wide, his lips parted slightly in shock. Mark smirked. "What? No data on that either?" Elliot's face turned scarlet. "Oh my God," Mark breathed, realization dawning. You haven't." "I have been very busy." Elliot cut in quickly. voice several octaves higher than usual. Mark just stared at him, his heart doing dangerous things in his chest. Because Elliot Carter chaotic, fearless, obnoxious Elliot Carter was completely inexperienced. And yet, he had still chosen Mark. Mark swallowed, something impossibly warm settling in his chest. He was so screwed. Elliot was fidgeting now, clearly panicking at Mark's silence. Look, it's not like I wasn't interested in people. I had other stuff going on. And then I started talking to you. And it was just. He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. It was different. Mark exhaled sharply. And then, without thinking, he kissed Elliot again. Elliot made a tiny, startled sound before responding, pressing closer, fingers gripping Mark's hoodie like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Mark felt everything in that kiss. The mess of emotions, the uncertainty, the trust, and most of all, the ridiculous, unbelievable fact that Elliot Carter, chaotic demon, fearless flirt, absolute disaster had somehow chosen him. Mark pulled back just enough to whisper against Elliot's lips. "You're an idiot." Elliot grinned. "And yet, here we are." Mark sighed, pressing their foreheads together. "Yeah," he said softly. "Here we are." Epilogue. Breakfast wars forever. The cafe once upon a brunch had become something of a local legend. A haven for book lovers, writers, and caffeine-dependent procrastinators. It was half cafe, half literary sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves. Fairy lights twinkled overhead. And every week, authors came in to do readings. Some were well-known, some were just starting out, but all were welcome. And, of course, there was story time. Every Friday and Saturday morning, children gathered on a plush reading rug near the front as Elliot dramatically acted out one of his own books or an old favorite, complete with over-the-top voices and theatrical flourishes. Today, he was in the middle of an animated reading of Captain Pancake's Breakfast Quest when he made the grave mistake of glancing over at Mark. Mark was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, wearing the insufferable smirk of a man who had won an argument 2 years ago and had yet to let it go. The second Elliot made eye contact, Mark mouthed, "Pancakes are better than waffles." Elliot nearly lost his place in the story. "You wish," he hissed under his breath before turning back to his audience, seamlessly slipping back into his pirate voice. And then, "Me hearties." Captain Pancake bravely sailed into the syrup sea. Mark chuckled to himself and went back to making espresso. Life was good. And then, predictably, chaos struck. Elliot, who had sworn he'd stay off social media during business hours, was suddenly locked in a furious Twitter or whatever platform they were using these days battle. He was muttering under his breath, his phone clutched in his hands, fingers flying. "Babe," Mark called from behind the counter, already exasperated. "You're in a fight again, aren't you?" This fool just said, "I need to." Elliot's eyes narrowed as he typed even faster. Mark sighed, set down the coffee he was making, and walked over. He leaned down, chin resting on Elliot's shoulder, peering at the screen. "Elliot," he said, as if speaking to a feral animal, "is this about grammar again?" "Yes," Elliot snapped, "because apparently, some people think an Oxford comma is optional." Mark laughed. "Okay, you're done." He plucked the phone from Elliot's hands. Elliot gasped in betrayal. "Mark, I was winning." "Sure you were." Mark pocketed the phone, giving Elliot a pointed look. "But you know what you could be doing instead?" Elliot folded his arms, pouting. "What?" Mark pulled something out of his apron pocket, a small velvet box. For a moment, Elliot's brain failed to process what he was looking at. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Oh my God." Mark, completely unfazed, popped open the box. "Elliot," he said, voice warm, "will you marry me?" Elliot blinked, then blinked again. Did you just?" His voice cracked as he gestured wildly at the phone Mark had just stolen. "Did you just propose?" "While I was fighting with someone online." Mark smirked. "Well, yeah, it felt very us." Elliot made a strangled sound, half laugh, half sob, and then tackled Mark so hard they nearly fell over. The cafe erupted into cheers. Nina threw a handful of sugar packets into the air like confetti. "Obviously, I am saying yes. You absolute menace," Elliot said, voice muffled against Mark's shoulder. Mark grinned, holding him tight. His chaos demon. His ridiculous, passionate, brilliant chaos demon. And now, his fiancée. Yeah, life was very good. And, for the record, pancakes were still better than waffles.